together to him, so that he got into a boat and sat, and the whole multitude stood on the shore. So I just want you to kind of put yourself in imagination that, and I'll just kind of use an example, figurative example here in St. Louis. Everybody trying to get to Jesus. Jesus down at the ark, Jesus gets on a boat and it pushes out away from the shore. And all people are there trying to hear what Jesus has to say, right? So what he does is, here in chapter 13, I'm going to get to my topic here in Matthew chapter 13, verse 33, but I just want to kind of bring you up to it. He says in verse number 3, then he spoke many things to them in parables. So here he starts off, chapter 13 is loaded with parables, but he gives us the first parable, which is that of the sower. And then he explained, the disciples like, man, why are you talking to me in parables, man? You just talk to me straight. And he explains why, but he goes on, and I'm going to come back to that, but he jumps and he tells the parable of the sower, and he explains it. Then he tells the parable of the wheat. Then he gets down to us, to this, he talks about the parable of the mustard seed. And then in verse number 33, it's this one verse, the parable of leaven. Parable of leaven. But let's back up a little bit, because we're gonna learn a little bit about cooking this morning, because it's important for you to kind of understand. I want to give you the definition of parable. But first I want to kind of give you the answer, and the question and the answer from the disciples, like, why are you talking to me in parables? So he says in verse number 3, then he spoke many things to them in parables, saying, behold, a sower went out to sow. Right? This is first parable. This is, and he tells the rest of that parable in verse number 4 through verse number 9. Verse number 10, if you drop down, because I'm not preaching today on the parable of the sower. I'm preaching on the parable of leaven. But I want you to understand that the disciples, after they heard this parable, they say, and the disciples came in verse number 10 of Matthew chapter 13, come and see him. It says, and the disciples came and said to him, why do you speak to them in parables? He answered and said to them, because it has been given to you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it has not been given. For whoever has, to him more will be given, and he will have abundance. But whoever does not have, even what has will be taken away from him. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because seeing they do not see, and hearing they do not hear, nor do they understand. He's speaking to them in parables. They can hear it, they can see it, but they don't understand it. But the disciples were given the ability to understand it. So that kind of brings us to the question, right? What is a parable? So I'll make sure we all walking together and understanding together. So, and before I do that, this lesson is kind of special because of the way in which it came about.
Recording in progress.
I had my daughter had a whole lot. She came down the other day and says, I want to debate. And this was a text that we debated on for about an hour and a half last night. Then we moved on to a communion, and we debated on communion and what was communion all about. And as I take a step back, I recognize the privilege and the grace that God has shown for me to even be able to sit down with one of my children and have a biblical conversation. I realize that that's not a given, and that's not a automatic thing. So so that the creation of this text and this lesson and this study that we will go through today has a little bit of a mixing of different perspectives in the lesson today. So, what is a parable? What is a parable? So, the definition of a parable is It's a simple illustrative story used primarily by Jesus in the New Testament to teach moral or spiritual lessons. He's trying to teach us something. He's using this to teach. Parables are a type of an analogy where illustrations and elements, everyday things that the people he's talking to should be able to relate to, things that they should, or elements that they should understand, like a farmer, like seed, like yeast or leaven, like banquets. He uses these things because most of the folks at that time that he's talking to, they understand what a farmer is, they understand what a banquet is, they understand what yeast is. Now, unfortunately today, since some of us don't stop cooking, it does, and we wouldn't recognize it if we saw it. Don't worry, by the time we get done today, you're going to recognize something about some yeast and what it is and how it works. Amen? I thought long and hard about putting some pictures up there, but I said, no. Maybe next time what I'll do is get an illustration and I'll show you the before and the after effect of leaven. This thing, it used to convey deeper truths about God, the kingdom of heaven, ethical behaviors, and the nature of human beings. These parables or stories often have a surprising twist to them, meaning that you might think the story going one way, but it goes a different way. So with that, we all on the same page of how the biblical context, kind of how we're getting here, and what the parables are, what a parable is, and that he's talking to some folks that some of the folk won't understand it, but other folk ain't gonna understand it because goes on and says it is a fulfillment of the prophecy of Isaiah. When you drop on down to verse number 14 on through, he tells you the why, because he's fulfilling prophecy. So let's just talk about this leaven and this yeast and its context. So what is it, right? So I'm trying to be very careful because I want to make sure that I don't add to or take nothing